Welcome to Science and Wisdom Live, where scientists and meditators meet.
It's really a privilege to be moderating this talk. It's one of my favorite topics, which I don't know how many people can say that, but probably all the panelists can. And I'd like to just hand it over right away to listen to all your wisdom. The first thing we wanted to talk a little bit about is just the role of how difficult it is in Western society to talk about death. You know, I think we're not that great about discussing this topic compared to some other cultures. And I wondered to each of you if you could reflect a little on why society has marginalized and hidden the death process in a lot of ways. What are the effects of that? How we open up more to death? And we could start out with Cynthia, if you like.
Thank you so much, Scott. And it's great to be with all of you today and our esteemed panelists. I'm excited about our conversation. So in response to your question, Scott, I think that the challenge around having a conversation around death in Western society really is focused around this notion of the unknown. And I think as human beings, we tend to have a fear and anxiety around the uncertainty of what we have never experienced, or many times we haven't had the opportunity to hear from trusted entities, trusted individuals that have gone that route of dying. Of course, more people now are doing more study and reading about near-death experiences. Certainly the internet has chock full of near-death experiences and stories that people share and tell. But I think as it relates to why we don't talk about it, it is an issue that we really have never experienced. Most people have not. And simply the fear of the unknown and not knowing how to process it. So that would be my initial response to the question.
Eva, do you want to reflect a little on?
Yeah, and again, just such a joy to be here with each of you and with all of you listening. It strikes me just now as you were speaking, Cynthia, there's a kind of a catch-22 here, that on the one hand, there are such diversity of views in our society as to not just about what happens when we die, but who are we, what is the world made of? And the irresolved, I won't say irresolvable, but in the basically culturally unresolved questions around the nature of existence means that there is such uncertainty about death. But the very motivation to ask those questions with a gravity and a sincerity and an urgency so often comes from thinking about death. And so an avoidance of even thinking about death continues to reinforce our confusion and our, in a way, an agnosticism at the broadest level of just not being sure and therefore not really wanting to be sure. But if we could really think clearly and deeply about death in a sober way, that might encourage us to ask the philosophical or religious questions more deeply, and vice versa. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
And Nigel.
Thank you. Yes, well, I was, in a sense, fortunate that my own father had a near-death experience, and that this was during the Second World War. And whilst he was fighting in the jungle, he received terrible wounds. And actually, having arrived at the surgical tent in the jungle, he actually was recorded having died. But he came back to life, and well, Peter Fenwick described in quite detail actually what you experienced, which I can corroborate. Now, it seemed to me quite strange then to actually encounter the idea and the terror of death in people, having been raised in a philosophically different environment. Both my parents, by the way, as a result of that experience, became Sufis because they were very interested in the idea that, having been raised as Christians, that if you didn't believe in Christ, then you weren't going anywhere but an unpleasant place. So they broadened their view and were attracted to Sufism. Now, having grown up and trained and worked as a scientist and engineer, of course, I can speak firsthand that in that profession, you just don't talk about anything. You can talk about death so long as you're just talking about death. But you can't talk about life after death. You can't talk about near-death experiences. If you do, your academic career is curtailed pretty quickly. Peter Fenwick is lucky. He's found a niche and an ability to speak out and do research. But I can tell you that's not the experience of most workers in that field. Now, my own view, of course, as a result, is that the scientific paradigm that there is no God, there is no such thing as spirit, is what has become to prevail in our society. As Nietzsche said, God is dead. And as a result, so what do we do? If we cannot pray, if there's no point in praying, there's no point going to church or to synagogue or temple, what do? Well, we come to see psychotherapists these days. They've become the new listeners to these sad tales of life. And so that combined with an increasing sense of materialism, the grip of materialism, the grip of addiction, to addiction to our phones, to our screens, to drugs, to alcohol, goodness knows, means that we are not allowing any moments of silence to reflect. I find people are terrified of being without a phone. They're terrified of being alone. They're terrified of, looking at anything, let alone death. And so I would say that is the real issue, is the fact that we no longer have an ability, that we don't have a lexicon for talking about spiritual experiences. It's being exorcised from our language. And so we are unable to talk. And one of the roles of a psychotherapist, I find, is to help your client find that language, to describe their actual experience, whether it is dying or whether it is experiencing something mystical. So that's what I wanted to say.
I like it. You bring up that that Nietzsche quote, "God is dead." There's a joke about that where Nietzsche says God is dead, and then God says Nietzsche is dead. I wonder if you could reflect a little on how we open up more to death. I think you each explained it from your great points of view of why we don't talk about death in our culture. And but can we talk about how we do open it up to it? And each of you has quite a unique point of view on that. Maybe Eva could start.
I think it's so tightly related to the question of the meaning of life. And of course, everybody has a slightly different way of answering that question. But for me personally, and maybe this is what you had in mind because we spoke about it before, the very experience of being in solitary retreat for an extended period of time is a kind of a facsimile of a death process that I personally, and I know that many, probably thousands or tens of thousands of practitioners over the centuries have found to be true, that by enacting that experience of withdrawal, giving up so many relationships, activities, even research projects, the sort of forward drive that so many of us associate with being alive, and channeling that energy, hopefully for still healthy and alive mind and body, into a single pointed questioning, seeking pursuit of the nature of reality, the nature of our being, the nature of the phrase that comes to mind in a Heideggerian sense, being unto death, but not in an atheistic way, not in a barren way, but a sense that being unto death is not a finitude that somehow reflects back on just, oh, this is a finite life and that's what gives it meaning, but rather a seeking forward into an infinite future, which is certainly what I simply see to be true, that our consciousness has an infinite past and has an infinite future. And so what we're doing within this finite particular lifetime is creating the nature of that future. And so by going into deep retreat or going into a contemplative practice on a daily basis, one has the opportunity to ask the, I want to say, the very raw existential questions. If everything collapsed at this moment, all my memories maybe flooding, certain ones coming very, very strong, can I face that person without regret? And can I accept and rejoice in the things that I've done in this life and channel that forward into some kind of clear vision of the future of, if I am going to continue, who do I want to be? How do I want to serve? How do I want to continue to interact with an entire universe of sentient beings, of conscious beings, whom I may be able to benefit much more in a future existence than I can now. So I'll leave it there for this part of the conversation.
I'd like to just chime in on that the question, and thank you for those thoughts and reflections, Eva. In almost 30 years of being involved in both palliative care and hospice care, as an educator, as a trainer, as a marketing person, even, if you will, it's been fascinating to walk alongside with people that are dealing with advanced illness and ultimately end of life. And I've been very fortunate, I would say blessed even, to be present with people in their dying hour and dying hours, and have that incredible experience. And it is an incredible experience. I'd like to reflect on a quote from a great theologian, Charles Spurgeon, back in the 1800s. He had this perspective. He says it relates to death. He says, depend upon it. Your dying hour will be the best hour you've ever known. Your last moment will be your richest moment, better than the day of your birth will be the day of your death. It shall be the beginning of heaven, the rising of the sun that shall go down no more forever. I love that quote, because when I think about experiences that I've had with people in their dying moment, I've had the opportunity not only to be with them in that moment, but also walk alongside them through the processes of dying and coming to the inevitability that they will leave this earth. And to your point, Eva, there is always this question about, why was I given the gift of life? What is the meaning for life for me as an individual? And having walked through that process with individuals, I think that this whole death notion is one that brings not only alignment, the similarities that we have as a people. We have a lot of issues with race and gender, nationalities, ethnicities in our world, certainly in our various countries. But death is a great equalizer in many ways, because we're all going this route. So my experiences involved as a trainer and a person that has the blessing of walking alongside people is to experience that moment where we're all the same, where we all have to deal with the reality that we are going through this path. And therefore, it is an opportunity to really, in an interesting way, know more about love. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I love about this subject of death and dying is that it not only brings us together as humanity, and it deals with the depths of humanity and the real nature of what equality and true freedom is all about, but it also allows us to have a moment where we can truly connect in a love moment that is not quote unquote sexual, that is not quote unquote even necessarily emotional, it transcends in a way that can only be described if you happen to be in that place. There's so much I could say about it, but I'm looking forward to our continued conversation, so I will try to be cool.
You want to reflect on this, Nigel, how we open up more to death?
Yes, I think what Cynthia said is really cool. I think,
it is.
especially about love. I think that's, in Sufism, that is the key issue. When we talk about the heart, the whole purpose of opening the heart is to experience that love. You see, that is not just personal, but it transcends all differences. So to come back to the question, do we die or do we not? That's an interesting question. In Sufism, we say most of us are dead in this world, and we're waiting to come alive. In Christian terms, you talk about waiting for resurrection, see, to resurrect via the being of Christ or whatever. So our whole practice is to die before death. I mean, death is, of course, a profound moment, as I've witnessed many, many times. And it does bring out something very special in people, not only the person dying, but those around them. But actually, the issue, how do we actually experience death before we die? And I would say what we do is we look at the cycles of nature, look at life itself. It tells you all the time, there is life and there's death. And death is not the end. It always averts itself to life. We have the seasons, we have crises come and crises go. Politicians come, politicians go. All these things actually don't just suddenly come to an end. There's a constant churning over and being reborn. So for me, it's about the practice of knowing that we are dying in every moment and we're coming alive in every moment.
Wanted to move on to near-death experiences, which we talked a little bit in the last session. The near-death experiences don't necessarily tell us what happens after we're dead, but they certainly tell us something about what happens as we're dying. And in Buddhism, there's a whole branch of literature that discusses how your mind and your perception change as you move on to an intermediate state called the bardo. And there's other teachings in other traditions too. Could each of you tell us a little bit about what you think is happening as we're dying? What states and what emotions we pass through? If any of you would like to start.
Okay, I'll start then. Well, one thing I found quite surprising, well, it's not surprising, but that in going through the experiences on retreat of dying, is that you go through the same stages that are described in the Tibetan Buddhist literature. That you first you lose the corporeal consciousness. You start losing weight. You actually start to dry. In other words, you start losing the water consciousness, and then certainly the fire comes, but then that averts itself to something to do with the mind. You get to a stage where you cannot think. You cease to think. You even forget your name. As you go through this experience, which we call fana, and then that fire in us changes to light, and that's all there is. And so for us, it's just a question, the process of dying is just letting go different bodies. The gross body, in Buddhist terms, subtle body, very subtle body. As you become aware of each plane of consciousness, your thinking changes, your perception changes, your sense of consciousness changes. And it brings us closer to the sense of, well, who am I then? See, what is I? See? And ultimately, there's just I. There is one, just one, and that's it. That's how we see that.
I think just to add a little more detail and confirm everything you said, Nigel, about these stages of death as they're described in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Of course, within Tibetan Buddhism, in the Vajrayana context, there are meditations where one quite deliberately, numerous times a day, rehearses the death process, learning to imagine, because of course that's all one can do at that point, imagine the stages of dissolution of the elements. And there are many different levels at which that progressive dissolution of the power of earth, actually it loses its power. And so then water seems to proliferate, seems to get stronger. But then the power of the water element, both in our perception of the outer world, but also especially our perception of our body, that in turn loses its power. And so of course, we can associate it that at the most coarse level with the fact that there is a drying, there's a thirst, there is a parching when someone, I would like to say, has the privilege of going through a slow death process. If there's an accidental, very swift or violent death, of course, all these things happen in an instant. And that would be, in general, much more terrifying unless a person's mind and spirit are very, very prepared for that process, no matter how it happens, whether slowly or quickly. But then moving from that process of the loss of power of the water element, the heat element would be stronger for a short time, but that in turn loses its power. And so, as you say, this dissolution of fire into light, but that light is actually, it's the air or the wind element, which is losing its power, even the power of breath. And that would be approximately the time at which the coarse breath stops, and one might be pronounced dead from an outer perspective. But according to Tibetan Buddhism, and there may be more detail in that particular literature than any other literature we have in our world right now, that's when mental consciousness itself, the kind of consciousness with which we have perceived our own thoughts, perceived our own emotions, perceived memories, inclinations, desires, and so on throughout our whole lives, that very mental consciousness ceases to function. And so, as you said, Nigel, and I can say I never actually had that experience in retreat of losing conceptuality in such a way that I didn't know who I was, or I know the liminal space in which one sees how easy it would be to lose that. But I think different retreat techniques actually lead to different experiences. And so, as I say, within the Vajrayana practices, it's almost more programmatized so that one maintains complete lucidity and a kind of I hate to use this word self-consciousness, but a distance from the process, that there's the ability to know where one is in it and start over again in the next session or at will. But so, as I'm saying, in this moment, then when mental consciousness, the very capacity to conceptualize in the actual death process, of course, that will dissolve. In very deep states of meditation, of course, that will dissolve. And then there are these subtler states of consciousness that it's like one is plunging to a whole other dimension of consciousness, which is free of conceptuality. It is free of individual identification, but it's not as though one's merging into everybody else's consciousness at that point. Certainly from a Tibetan Buddhist perspective, that's the point at which one is seeing the ground core conscious awareness that has been the ground of one's being all along. And so then if I shift into Christian terms, to me, this is like saying, if we understood theologically God to be the ground of being that enables every state of consciousness, every state of interaction with the material world to take place, then we are truly seeing the ground of our being. There would be the encounter with the divine ground. And then, of course, depending on how one has lived, that will be a drastically different experience, depending on who one is coming into it. So that would then tie back to, if as a society we could think and want to think more about these things, prepare, practice in such a way that it's the priority of our lives, then we could face that experience without fear, without regret, even with joy, even with anticipation of this is what I've been longing for my whole life.
Mm. Yeah, and then Cynthia, how about your own? You have a lot of direct experience with people as they're dying, and also, from the Christian perspective, what's your perspective on what's happening as we're dying?
Yes, I appreciate my scientific partners and perspectives. And from a Christian perspective, of course, Jesus Christ being the center of our faith in terms of Christianity, Jesus talked about going to prepare a place for us. And if he goes and prepare a place, well, he will come again and receive us unto himself. And I ascribe to that because I believe that, and based on my own experiences and studies, many years of training in seminary and actually experiential, even with my own family members where I've been present, I believe that consciousness, actually, there is a transition of consciousness. We've had opportunity to work very closely with people that have dementia and have mental deterioration, if you will, and seeing people have actually go into a period which many times we refer to it as a burst of energy. I think there are various terminologies that speak to what happens when people get to that moment of death. And many times people will sit up, and Dr. Fenwick even referred to it. There's this renewed sense of clarity. People sometimes recognize those loved ones that they couldn't recognize prior. So I believe that there is an awakening of consciousness as we go through that process of transition. And ultimately, people that believe in God, believe in higher being, I believe, based on my readings and conversations with folks that have had near-death experiences, that as they many times refer to this type of tunnel that they go through, there is this opportunity to be met by light. And that light always seems to be described as love and peace and this sense of wholeness, if you will. And so I ascribe to that thinking, both through studies and my own studies in literature and experientially, both professionally and personally. There is really, I believe, that transition from what we could call death to life is really always a continuation in my mind of living. It's just at a higher consciousness.
Mm. Now I'd like to ask each of you what happens after you die. A difficult question. Thinking about the differences between Buddhist, Christian, Sufi, atheist ways of dying. Do we constantly die and are we reborn? Is there a heaven? Can we get uploaded into virtual reality? It's obviously a question of great interest to people and in culture too. There's so many television programs, movies with fresh takes on this. So I'd love to hear each of you reflect a little bit on what happens after you die. Maybe to start with Cynthia, if you like.
Thank you. I would just continue on the line of thinking that as I was just sharing in what I have read and heard from people that have actually had near-death experiences. And what I've continued to hear, there is some consistency in that transition process of feeling as though they're going through some type of tunnel or a dark place, if you will. I think I've had the sense that some people find it very frightening. Others have found it not so frightening. So I think it speaks to the fact that we can experience emotion in that journey, if you will, but ultimately being confronted with brilliant light. I was just reflecting on some readings that I've had for many years in the palliative care and hospice movement. And one writer says, it's a love you'll never want to leave. My mother is an example. Nigel, I appreciate your sharing personal stories as relates to your parents. My mom, when we were very young children, I'm one of five, had a near-death experience and said that she felt as though she was in God's presence. There was so much light and love, and there was a communication with her that it's not your time. This is not your time. And I never got the sense that this was related to any illness in particular, but it was almost like she felt she was dying in her sleep. But she was confronted with this sense of, she felt that it was the Lord and love and light, and says, it's not your time yet, but gave her this strong sense of purpose in being and my mother is living today at 91 years old, very sharp-minded, continues to be very active. And I just reflect on the fact that that story, she is still fueled by that experience when she felt she left this earth, but was confronted and engaged with her Lord. So I think that this near-death experience is one that brings a renewed consciousness. I think a deeper spirituality for individuals, a renewed sense, or even a new sense of meaning in life, and probably a deeper sense of being connected to what it means to be fully alive and be more of a caring, loving, compassionate individual.
Yeah, Eva.
Shall I go?
Yes, please.
So when you shared these questions with us earlier, I saw myself respond to the very phrasing of the question as though those who are Buddhist, Christian, Sufi, atheist, and so on would die differently. And I think this is a very sensitive question in our culture, that oftentimes people think that what they believe about the things we don't really know about is going to make them be that way. And I think there's an extent to which, a great extent to which, the way we have thought and believed in our lifetimes will affect the way we experience the death process and what happens afterward. For sure, I've already said that. But it's not as though believing that, for example, in a materialist view, it's not as though believing that, well, I'm just matter, so when my brain is dead, then I cease to exist. If that's not true, it's not as though believing it would make it true. There is something, and this is fundamental to my own worldview, there's something about the nature of consciousness that is as basic to our reality as gravity or electromagnetic forces or any of the other things that we think of as laws of nature. And so just not believing in gravity won't stop it from working. And I think, back to our first question, it would be extremely important to our culture to start to think about death and dying as something we have to find out, because it's one of the most important things about reality we need to know. But then we come to, certainly within religious traditions, which perhaps have given more thought and emphasis to the death process for millennia than any other way of thinking, there is, of course, diversity as to what is said will happen. And in co-writing with my mother, Veronica Mary Rolfe, our book, Living Resurrected Lives, it was a great challenge for me to think through, in a Buddhist way, in a Christian way, in tandem, was there a way of thinking about resurrection as it is promised, as it is at the core of the Christian revelation, in a way that, I won't say just for me, but philosophically, at a logical, rational level, could be completely congruent with the other set of ideas with which I'm most familiar, the Tibetan Buddhist teachings on what happens when we die. And I have to say that there are certain areas that, from a linguistic point of view, from a gospel point of view, they sound really different. And one quotation that I just wanted to share, because I think it's a core from the Christian tradition, as the basis of Christian belief in resurrection and in what happens after we die. It's from St. Paul's letter to the Romans. If the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also through his spirit that dwells in you. And I think in a traditional Christian sense, there's been a very strong bifurcation. And it's a very long story, whether this is legitimate or not. I think there are a lot of historical circumstances, not the only way to interpret the Christian revelation, that there's a kind of a either or. Either the spirit of Christ dwells in you and you're on your way to the perfection of resurrection, or eternal damnation. I think there are many, many ways of giving one's entire life to the Christian revelation and not seeing that as a strict bifurcation, so that there are many more layers. Of course, purgatory is a difficult and complex idea as well. But if we look at that, it's the spirit of him who raised Jesus, the spirit of God, the spirit of the Father, the Holy Spirit, who dwells. What does it mean for the spirit to dwell in us? And I think Cynthia and Nigel, as you both described these near-death experiences where there is a glory of light, a glory of encountering ultimate love, I would see that as a sign that that is a person who has been living with that spirit, with that divine spirit of love throughout their lives, maybe more or less veiled, but in such a way that when an opening comes, then they can recognize, they can meet the Lord in very Christian terms. In Buddhist terms, that would be described more as the purity of a mind that's able to recognize those states of death without fear, and with virtue that is propelling them toward a more positive rebirth. But of course, at very, very advanced stages of the path, that could be the doorway to enlightenment itself. I think I'll stop there without going into more details on so many layers. But maybe the main point that I'm trying to say is, if we can see resurrection in a Christian sense as something that is a fundamental transformation of the consciousness, the mind, and with that, the kind of bodies we will have. St. Paul goes into great detail on what is this spiritual body, and then the tradition after him. What is the nature of a spiritual body as opposed to the natural body that we had in this life that was so dragged down by passions, mental afflictions, sin, and so on? What would the infinite opening to a new kind of life, a new kind of body, a new kind of mind that could happen when we have devoted ourselves to some kind of high path of purification during our lives?
Nigel, how about you? What happens
Yes, that's
after you die?
very comprehensive explanation.
Yeah.
Well, this is a huge question. So I'll try to be as brief as possible. I'll start with a story. It's a very simple story, Sufi story. Once upon a time, someone came to a Sufi dervish and said, well, you know what it's like to die. What happens? What's heaven like? So the dervish said, well, come into this room here and just sit there for an hour. And the man went in to sit in the room and came out after an hour. And the man said, I didn't experience anything. So the Sufi said, well, go to this other room and see what you experienced there. And so the man went to the other room, and this is supposed to be hell. He sat there for an hour and came out. He said, look, I'm sorry, I didn't experience anything. So how come people talk about heaven and hell? So the dervish said, well, those are things that you have to take with you. In other words, we create our own lives, which we see, of course, phenomenologically in our dreams. We see actually, like in looking into a mirror, what kind of mental world or mind world we are creating, you see. Now, having said that, I'll come to the next point, which is this issue of the tunnel that one goes down, whether it's a dark tunnel or a light tunnel or colorful tunnel, doesn't really matter. But one could think of it as kaleidoscoping through so many layers of consciousness as you let go of the corporeal body. In Sufism, and I talk about this only because I've experienced it myself, that in dying, you actually let go of the physical body and you experience the subtle body. The subtle body is the mind world. And you actually can experience it in lucid dreaming, or you can experience it as a living experience in your meditations or prayers. You see what your world, that inner world is that you've been creating. And then there comes a point where that must die. That consciousness dies. And so you leave that spirit body, which is a mental body, and then you move into your light body, which is what the Sufis call soul. I know in Buddhism one doesn't refer to anything like that because it's a dualistic way of thinking, but it is to do with your light. And then one sees that your inner world that you thought was the mind world is now lit up with light. It's a world transfigured by light. See? So, in other words, your experience is, well, those inner worlds are not that different from this world. It's not that, the trees, the mountains, the lakes, people, and so on, schools of thought, places of worship are much the same in the next world and the worlds to come. That it's just that they are more subtle. They're not so concrete. See? And that you begin to realize, well, what's real then? Because if it's not substantial, then what is real? Is there anything substantial? No, there isn't. That's the ultimate realization. And that's when you experience the final death, which is the Sufis call the black light, which is the unseen light. It's symbolized in Christianity by the Black Madonna. She symbolizes that experience where initially you can't think, everything goes, all the lights go out, and then comes the moment of resurrection where you suddenly realize you are in an uncreated world, a world that you're no longer creating, you're participating in it. So, and then that's not the end, because of course, as everyone says, it has to go to the sense of total union, and that it means there's a death of any sense of individuality. So that's how the Sufis see that. So that's that tunnel of light that we all go through, or tunnel of darkness we all go through. You don't see all the stages you're going through. It seems to happen very quickly. But I believe if one does it slowly, you slow down the experience, you would see stage by stage of the different realities, the different heavens, the different hells, which of course we all create.
Scott, if you don't mind, Nigel and Eva's comments triggered a thought as it relates to, and this is a slight diversion, but I hope you won't mind. I'm just processing the obviously present war that is happening in Ukraine, a lot of the tragedy that we're seeing in the States with the mass shootings of the young children. And so, I mean, we're obviously aware that dying is happening all the time, but when we think about tragic death and what that means to us as a society and as humanity itself, and I'm just curious in terms of what our thinking is as it relates to this notion of connectedness, because one of the things I'm seeing that's being born out of such tragedy is that there is this uniting of obviously grieving, uniting of trying to process solutions. But I think there's so much more that we as a society should explore. And I know I'm taking liberty here, but I was just wondering if even in this space we could explore, how do we reconcile with this kind of tragedy and what that means for us as in terms of our connectedness, and the potentiality of a birth that is positive out of so much pain.
Mhm. Well, certainly for my part, I would say that one can think of oneself as an individual, or you can reflect on your total interconnectedness with everyone and everything in the planet. In other words, you become a planet, you become one being. You're no longer the little I, the Nigel has died, okay? And so, how do we get to that point where we can think in such a way that we feel everyone? We're aware of the plant kingdoms and how they're dying, and the people who are dying in terrible war situations, not just Ukraine, but elsewhere in the world. And how can we wake up people who are effectively dead to all this? And so, for my part, I noticed that more and more people are through the media and through television are becoming more heartfelt. They see, we all begin to grieve collectively about what's happening, and it stirs something in us. I know many people, not just because of the pandemic, but because of what's happening right now, are questioning their lives. See, my life I've been leading has been so unconscious. I want to not just make a difference, but I want to wake up. So I see it as an awakening of the heart, that when humanity opens its heart as a being, then I think we will have the Jerusalem that is promised in Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thoroughly agree that if there is any good that can come out of these kind of tragedies and intense injustice, and it in no way mitigates or justifies the injustice, but insofar as all things can be turned to good, all things can be transformed, because as you said earlier, Nigel, we're dying moment by moment. Our whole world is dying moment by moment. And if we respond to things in ways that simply entrench and intensify our depression or despair or hopelessness, then that is the effect they will have. But if there's any way we can, as a global society, overcome the evil, overcome the injustice, it would be by transforming the very grief and compassion that arises into the intensity of intention and motivation that, and in Buddhism, of course, this is called bodhicitta. In Christianity, I think this is what we would call the mind of Christ, that is so vast in its scope of who it sees to be the children of God, the community of creation. And I'm not sure I'm using creation exactly the same way you just did, Nigel, but in that broader sense of that which exists here, then that compassion that has a mission to it, that isn't simply sympathy or sadness or grief, but has a mission to it, can indeed overcome collectively at a global scale the forces of entrenchment, narrowness, jealousy, greed, hatred, and so on that are perpetrating such evil and such tragedy. So yeah, that's my.
I think what kind of triggered the thought of, obviously, of sitting in the moment and processing a lot of the tragedy that we're seeing in our world. And Scott, as we were talking about, you raised a question about these near-death experiences. I was reflecting on a story that I had heard from a gentleman that did have a near-death experience, but his life experience, and he was a very young man, about 32 years old, was one where he felt he lived a very selfish life. He was very angry. He felt that he had not had good breaks in his life. And so kind of perpetuated not always the right attitude towards people, and was not sometimes the kindest person, if you will, had this near-death experience. And for him, he talked about the tunnel, he talked about feeling love, but he also said that that atmosphere changed, and he felt that his whole life was playing out in front of him, and he saw the pain that he had perpetuated on individuals, and so much so that he felt very sad and sorrowful for how he had lived his life up to that point. And so it just made, I just started thinking about, I don't think the near-death experience is always positive for everybody. I think in his instant, it was an opportunity to see himself in the true light of not really being the kind of person that he really wanted to be. And so we had the opportunity to come back into this living experience. For him, it was this transformation of being more deeply grounded in being the best person that he could be, and being more caring, being more sensitive, being more thoughtful, being more connected to not only himself, but his family and other individuals, people that he didn't know. So it certainly deepened his desire to be truly human, a truly living, breathing, consciously caring individual. So I just wanted to raise that, because all these near-death experiences have not always been positive and joyful.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
just wanted to add, just very briefly, that in Sufism we see the purpose of life, or the purpose of suffering, is that it breaks your heart.
Mm.
And when your heart breaks, then something happens to your sense of self. You begin to surrender. Your ego is humiliated. You really begin to become a lot more humble and prepared to care and listen to other people. So, and maybe that's what's happening right now.
Yeah. I wonder if I could ask you each a very practical question. We've talked a lot about death more as, each of us might experience it, but I wonder if you could each reflect on how we could each be good companions to the loved ones in our life as they die. It's a role we're probably each going to be in, and maybe have already been in. And maybe Cynthia, to start, I know this is your life's work.
It's a lovely question, Scott. I really appreciate it, because for me, family is so tremendously important. I've been very fortunate to have loving parents, both father and mother. I mentioned my mom is with us still. My father passed away, and I'd love to share that story, but it does not quite align with your questions. So it may have
Hey,
to come.
if it's relevant, go ahead and share. If it's beneficial, please.
I appreciate that, and forgive me if it seems diverted, but it came to me when we had our initial conversation with one another, and I thought, oh gosh, I've got to share that story. So when my beloved father was in his transition process of dying, my family lives in Ohio. I was living in Illinois, in Chicago at the time. But my dad was diagnosed to die. He had prostate cancer. It had metastasized throughout his body. He had been given 8 months to live. He actually lived 8 years, which is what really grounds me in the founding of the work that I do, because I believe in the embracing of the holistic approach to life, and what that can mean for us as human beings. So our story was, he was diagnosed with 8 months, he lived 8 years. So when Dad really got down to that last moment of that 8-year period, where he was supposed to have died many years earlier, I I had to make a decision whether or not to fly home to be with Dad and around his bedside where my mom and my 4 siblings were present, and my dad's and our the grandchildren. And so my husband said, maybe you should go this time, because again, Dad, they thought he was going to die many times, and he outlived the prognosis and had very good quality of life. So this time I said, yeah, maybe I should. So my 2-year-old daughter and myself were on the runway in the plane, and my little 2-year-old daughter looked out the window and said these exact words in this way: "There goes Granddad." And I froze, and I remember saying a prayer and talking to God, and I said, "Not now, Lord. Oh no." I immediately connected with the fact that this innocent 2-year-old, really baby, looked out the window and literally saw my dad's spirit, right, come to where we were in the plane on the runway to let both she and I know that he had transitioned, but he wanted us to see him. He wanted us to know that he was alive in another, right, mode, if you will, but he was gone. And literally she said it twice, because when I thought, "Not now, Lord," it's like this conversation was happening, but we were having it indirectly. When I said, "Not now, Lord," Jasmine said, "There goes Granddad," as if to say, "You didn't listen the first time, but I'm telling you again, there he goes." And so that experience always totally blew my mind. When we got off the plane, my sister-in-laws met us and said, "Cynthia, Dad has gone." And of course, I asked, "What time did he pass?" And it was the exact time when we were sitting on the runway, the exact time. So that experience really further reiterated for me just the notion of people that leave this earth, even when they transition, they have a way of communicating with family members and loved ones, and the significance of that. And again, I know that didn't go to your direct question, but that was heavy on my heart, and I had to share that because I think somebody needed to know that.
No, that's a beautiful story, and I really appreciate you sharing it. It's amazing when I think when people are brave enough to share things like that, because there's a bit of a bias in our culture to dismiss experiences like that. That there's really it's quite profound what you experienced, and inexplicable from a scientific perspective. So thank you for
But
sharing.
I didn't mean to divert your question. So
No, it's I love that. It's a wonderful story. It's a really wonderful story. Well, if either of you, Eva or Nigel, you can continue that thread of, some, profound mystical experiences yourself, or this practical question of how to be companions to the loved ones in our life, whichever way you want to go.
Well, okay, I'll have a go. First of all, I was very privileged to accompany my father when he died. He was in hospital. He died of pneumonia. But before his last breath, just before his last breath, he looked at me and he said, "Nigel," he said, "there's light all around you." And then he said, "The light will always be with you." And then he breathed out and he left. And that was, to me, was most precious as a memory. The second experience I had was a colleague of mine who sadly had liver cancer. And he had not a liver transplant, but they tried to regrow his liver in the laboratory and then put it back in. And it didn't quite work. And he came to see me and we chatted about it. And he didn't believe in life after death. And I said, well, just imagine how many things you're not going to have to put up with. Your your sister's aunties who's a pain in the butt, who lives with you, and all the tax man, you won't have to deal with that anymore. You don't have to deal with cancer anymore. And we began to laugh, and look at it actually quite positively. Not that we were denying the sense that he's going to die and that I would miss him, but it was interesting. And the third one, just to be brief, was another colleague who died, but he died in France rather than England. And I hadn't met him for about 12 months. He died of a heart attack suddenly. And on one of my retreats, I remember opening my eyes in the middle of the night, and there he was in front of me. And he came up to me, and although I couldn't hear him speak, I was saying, "How are you?" And he smiled, and he looked around so I could see where he was. And we had this moment of just meeting, and then he walked off into the mountains on his own, and then the scene vanished. And so I felt again very, very privileged to have experienced that.
Mm.
I think I'll mention what I had in our previous conversation about many of the times that loved ones or those I've known in this life have passed away when I was in retreat. And I have noticed how I actually felt that was the best place that I could have been during that process. I was aware of it, of course, by very conventional means, but that because of the whatever clarity of mind and a sense of vast scope and a transparency to other dimensions, I'll say that I, as a person, I'm not the kind of person who has these particular kinds of experiences and visionary things. I mean, that's maybe it's just my constitution. So I wouldn't say that I was having experiences of those individuals, but I sensed that I was able to tap in more deeply to that level of what is it that matters most about that person's life, and even in relation to the question of how can we be with those who are dying, how do we pray for those who are dying? How can we offer our intentions at a very sincere and deep level? And what I've found, especially because my life has bridged many different religious traditions, as is obvious, is that what I may believe or envision about what's happening to that person isn't necessarily what they're experiencing. And I don't want to somehow superimpose a particular vision of what that afterlife experience is, but rather the openness to, as we were saying before, how each person's life will shape, and their belief system will shape the nature of that experience. And actually, I want to clarify, here I'm speaking about the flexibility and variety within a consciousness that continues. That to me makes sense, but it's not as if one doesn't believe the consciousness continues, then it won't. That's the distinction I'm making, because that, whether or not it continues, seems to be a much more fundamental law of nature, law of reality. But saying that, I think then when it comes to being with the dying, my ideal would be that we can bring with us the vastness and the spaciousness and the centeredness, deep, deep centeredness of a retreat state of mind, of a contemplative state of mind, when we can be at the bedside, when we have the opportunity to be with the dying, not to get caught up in the emotions, or especially in our contemporary medical system, the frenzy, as it were, of medical decisions that sometimes need to be made, which seem to be such a radical distraction from this deep, sacred process that somebody is going through. And so I think it would be so wonderful if more of us, not necessarily only those who are trained professionals, but more of us as family members, as friends, can bring that kind of centeredness and an openness to what the person needs to go through, which is not necessarily what our own spiritual path or ideal might be. because of the intense plurality of our world. So I know that those may sound like abstractions, but I think, it's heartfelt. So
Wonderful. Okay, so Conrad asks a question for everybody. How do you understand reincarnation in your respective traditions? And specifically to Eva, how do you understand reincarnation through your Christian Buddhist studies? And he says specifically reincarnation as unconditional love of God. So reincarnation. You can start with Eva if you like.
Yeah, well, first, I think in order to have any meaningful conversation, especially across Christian and Buddhist lines, we need to at least be clear on what we mean by the word reincarnation versus rebirth, because reincarnation and rebirth have both been used very frequently in the English language to render two quite different concepts within Tibetan Buddhism. So rebirth, which is a very little translation, of the string of births, really, that the Buddha described, that he saw directly, that many, many masters through the history of Buddhist culture and practice have seen, whether through visionary experience or actual memory of their own past lives. And the idea, or the understanding there, is that there is a subtle stream of consciousness that simply continues, and that carries within it all of the habitual propensities or karmic seeds and tendencies of the actions one has created in a previous lifetime. And then, according to many different factors, some of those seeds actually have the power to project the kind of life one will have in a rebirth. And those may be replete with suffering. They may be in between, like the human realm, or they may be much more pleasant realms. It actually reminded me of that when you said, Nigel, about these progressively subtler and subtler realms that one may go through. But within Buddhism, that's not even higher realms, as they're called, of the form or formless realms, which are very subtle and rarefied. Those are not at all seen as a goal, because they can be a temporary goal, but it's not the goal of liberation or enlightenment, because the very causes that created those realms are in themselves finite, and so one can't stay in those realms forever either. So that's a very rough presentation of rebirth. But then reincarnation may be more appropriately used for the idea of what we know in English now, this word tuku, which is the Tibetan for nirmanakaya, as in one who has been sent, one who is actualizing the wishes, the sacred intents of a highly realized being, who has some control, who has some very deliberate choice about how they will be born into a human realm. But then there's yet another category, which is the body of an enlightened being, which can be countless emanations of form bodies. But the rarefied, subtle form can be referred to as the Sambhogakaya, and it's closely related to what in the Dzogchen tradition or the Great Perfection tradition is called the rainbow body. I won't go into any details there, but the idea that there can be an eternal life after death, which at the very subtle level is embodied and then can emanate countless even coarse bodies and coarse forms that can appear in our world, is very, very different from the idea of rebirth within the cycle of samsara. And I think for Christianity to understand more deeply resurrection, as in the resurrection of Jesus, as in the resurrection that's promised to the saints and ultimately all humanity, I do need to limit the word to that within a Christian context, all humanity, once they have reached that which is salvation, can we distinguish that from the ordinary cycle of consciousness continuing, which may, and this to me is what opens the doorway to having many, many, many more possibilities than simply damnation, some kind of purgatory that we don't quite understand, and resurrection, but that there's this vast range of possibilities of how consciousness may continue in a lifetime that may be better or worse than this one. But I guess I'll put it this way. If I really have to speak across traditions, because of the offering of that Christ made in his historical lifetime and the revelation of the resurrection, and that language is used, he revealed the resurrection. Once somebody has a connection with that, that is the offering of the possibility to have all the causes necessary to enter into a heavenly life in the next life, and ultimately be ready for the resurrected life, leaving room for a continued process. But to deny or reject that offering of Christ once one has encountered it, to speak in Buddhist terms, would be like having been offered the whole path to enlightenment and the connection with an authentic guru, and then turning away from it and turning one's back on it. And so I can see from Buddhist logic why deliberately turning away from a Christian path, when it's been offered and when one can understand it and connect with it properly, would be tantamount to walking away from a fully qualified guru. So I can't possibly answer all of that question now, but maybe that's a start to it.
Anyone else want to reflect on reincarnation?
Okay, well, I will try to give a Sufi point of view, which, if I can read between the lines, Eva, might possibly kind of resonate a little bit with what you're saying, although superficially it looks like there's a very distinct difference. Sufis, to be blunt, don't believe in reincarnation. So that's the first jolt for those of you who believe in reincarnation. But of course, let's look at that before we first in detail before we reject that idea. In Sufism, we don't reject the idea of reincarnation per se, but what we reject is the idea that the soul, an individual soul, will actually come back into this world and keep going round until such time that it's liberated, and then it moves on. Rather, what the Sufis see as it is your personality that reincarnates. In other words, how does that happen? That your soul moves to the next world, and the incoming souls who are innocent, someone might meet you, as we do in this world. We meet each other, we make impressions on each other, we maybe they carry something of your vibration with them as they incarnate into this world. And that in itself could possibly be an explanation for why people have such detailed memories of past lives, because it would not just be one life, it could be many lives. You might remember several lives. Maybe one is more prominent than others. And that for the soul who's departing, that soul simply moves on in their life through the mind world until such time that it's time to, or they are ready, shall we say, put it that way, they're more consciously aware to move on to the next more subtle body. Now, it's we only see this in some cases. Some people show remarkable talents at birth. There is people who show the hallmarks of a genius, and yet not everyone who shows such talent manifests that talent as an adult. So the question is, was it really their own true nature, or was it something they took on? So it's just an interesting question. So that's the Sufi view. It doesn't mean to be disharmonious with the Buddhist view, but that's how we see that. So, and I can't verify because I don't know if I've come back here again or not. So.
I don't have a lot to add. I think it's been a very engaging conversation as it relates to reincarnation. Certainly a lot to think about. I think from a strictly Christian tradition, as we source the Bible as our primary source of information, knowledge, wisdom, truth, there doesn't appear to be any direct conversation around reincarnation from the definition. And I think this goes back to your point, Eva, and how we might define reincarnation. I think we typically may think of it as the dying and then coming back in another form of life source. And from that perspective, the Bible doesn't have a lot to say about reincarnation. It speaks to the fact that there is appointed one time to die, and afterwards there is a period, this process of judgment and how we lived our lives and that sort of thing. So I don't have a lot to add other than the fact that from a Christian perspective, it is not viewed as the approach, if you will, that Christians agree with, nor does the Bible speak about reincarnation.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions from the audience?
Yes, let me ask a question first. So I also have a question. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing, and I think especially also your personal stories were really touching and just really goosebumps. So thank you so much for that. I have a question about the relation of suffering to what you've been talking about, this experience of clear light, and it goes back to what Cynthia has been saying, but also some bit of Eva and Nigel have been saying. So of course we're human beings or sentient beings, and we'll experience suffering. And I think this is something that we see in all the major religions. You know, of course, in Christianity, there's the Via Crucis, the suffering of Christ. In Sufism, there's, I remember this beautiful story of the Conference of the Birds who go through 7 valleys in order to actually suffer in a way and get rid of their ego, you could say. Well, in Buddhism, there is, of course, the Buddha who just before enlightenment sees many visions of war and other troubling sights, and he's able to reject those. So my question is really about how does suffering prepare us in a way to be able to let go of something at the moment of death? Could you all respond to that, please? Thank you.
I think so much of the fear of death comes either from simple awareness of the unknown, or as you mentioned in this near-death experience, if someone does become intensely aware that I wasn't living the way I wanted to, then that can be a very legitimate reason to fear death. But at the deepest level, it is a grasping to the existence of what we think we are now, and being afraid to exist in any other way because we're not sure if that'll be better or worse. And so suffering strips us. I mean, that's almost just part of all of our experience of suffering is either we can just turn into anger, resentment, grief, frustration, or if we can surrender. And I think each of the great religious traditions has such a pure and clear way of dealing with suffering in a way that we surrender and seek to make it holy, seek to make it meaningful. Then that can be an instrument of stripping us of the very layers of armor we had put up to protect the self we thought we were. But once we realize we can't do that anymore, we're actually letting go of the grasping that certainly from a Buddhist explanation point of view would be, it's that grasping that is the very cause of the suffering that would continue after a death in a new existence. And so insofar as we can allow suffering to strip us of our grasping to the self we thought we were, then when we reach what would seem to be the ultimate suffering of death, where everything that was familiar, that we grasped to, that we identified with is stripped from us, is lost. If we've already practiced letting that go again and again and again through intense periods of suffering or mild periods of suffering, then it's that much easier to do so in the death process. And there's that kind of vast, open-hearted fearlessness that says, well, what could be worse? What could be worse? And we've let go of the self we thought we were grasping to. And this is a word I don't think we've said yet, the surrender in death, which I think so many people do experience, whether or not they've had a religious conviction, the surrender to a state of consciousness, a state of being so much greater than what they had thought they were during this lifetime. If we can see suffering in such a way that it opens us to that, rather than makes us clamp down further. So it's not necessary that all suffering will prepare us better for death, depending on how we react to it. But if we react to it in this sacred offering kind of way, and certainly I'm so familiar with the way one does that in Christianity, in union with the suffering of Christ, that is the prime example, the prime model of how to turn suffering into the ultimate offering on the cross, then it can actually be intensely beneficial. Suffering, that is.
The subject of suffering, I'm really pleased that you raised that point, because I think it is, when we think about the human experience, and I view life as a type of journey. I think it is an important part of the journey of life. Even though when we think of suffering, we think of the notion of pain or grief or discomfort. It is not a topic that generates a sense of joy, certainly. But it certainly does, and I align with the word surrender. It certainly positions us to let go, to learn how to let go. I think that this journey of life is very intentionally designed to teach us how to begin to learn to let go. If we think of children and their experiences with their toys, and what we as parents try to teach our children in terms of sharing, and not so much focus on their own ego and their own selfish needs, but this notion of suffering really brings me to a mental picture of, when I think of life and humanity, I think of, imagine with me a huge heart shape, the shape of a heart, as we often think about a heart of love. And I see, my perspective is that all humanity fits into that heart. We are all a part of this one big, wonderful heart shape. But many times suffering has to allow us to go through a process where we learn to let go of our own selfish thoughts, ambitions, ways of thinking, ways of being that are not aligned with this true sense of being part of the community and the unity of love. It brings to mind a bigger picture that life is meant to be more than just our own selfish pursuits, but pursuits as it relates to the whole of humanity, that big heart shape where we're all intentionally and purposefully connected to, but many of us have to go through processes to see the bigger picture. And it's not just about us, but it's about all of us. So there is some sense of suffering making sense if we think about it from the broader picture of what's being shed and how we let go of our own selfish egos, and see life from the perspective of that wholeness that embraces all of humanity.
I think we have one more question. Time for one more question, perhaps.
Yes, thanks, Scott. So we have a question from Joe. Can you all please speak about the importance of formal practices, meditation, contemplation, and so on, to both have a taste or a glimpse of reality's less consciousness and practice dying now? So what's the importance of formal meditation practices and the first person experience as opposed to solely third person speculations?
Well, from my own point of view, that meditations and various spiritual disciplines are there to tune us, to awaken our sensitivity to something deeper in us, which is our deeper consciousness. But of course, you know, to live a life that is a kind of living meditation, I think is even more meaningful and more important, that one lives one's spirituality and in everything that you do. In other words, in your consideration of other people, of your being able to put yourself aside sometimes for a greater good. These are even more important things. They're even more powerful. The idea of meditation is like it winds up your clock and gives you the kind of good perspective to go out with. But of course, you could find your car clamped and so the tow truck's towing it away. And because you might have lost your meditation in an instant, unless you really do have a strong sense of non-attachment. But I think it really begins with how you are and how you are with people. I think that's one of the most important things. So
I do think there are experiences that one can gain from meditation that bring a certainty of certainly the fundamental nature of consciousness and the irreducibility of consciousness. There are ways one can experience this isn't going away. This isn't subject to forces. Consciousness itself is not subject to the material forces of birth and decay that bodies are. And so more than actually any reasoning, I think people who have meditated a great deal and are open to the meditation itself changing their worldview might have tastes of these things that no amount of argumentation could sway them from. And then likewise, as I said, at a very, not necessarily advanced level, but it takes a lot of training to be able to go into the Vajrayana meditations that, as I say, are rehearsing that death process and deliberately transforming it as one does so. Those, I think, can offer a familiarity. That's exactly what they're intended. Well, they're intended for many more things than that. But by the by, they create a familiarity with that sequence of dissolutions, the nature of these visions of pure, vast light that we see described in near-death experiences, that if one's not so fortunate, I would say, to have had a near-death experience and have that really intense foretaste of what death will be like, practicing authentic meditations that have been passed down for over 1,000 years, thousands of years by experienced practitioners, realized practitioners, it's like a gift of, oh, we can actually anticipate this. We can practice in anticipation of this. And it's not something to be feared or something to be hidden in the closet of, I don't know. So I don't want to think about it.
Wow, the subject of meditation is exciting for me on many levels. I think the sheer opportunity that we have as humanity to connect, as we might refer to this notion of going deeper, connecting to, from my Christian perspective, being in and having that experience of being in the very presence of God. And I remember as a child having a meditative experience as I was praying, and it literally frightened me because I felt myself like I was leaving my body, and I was in this state of pure I wouldn't describe it necessarily as ecstasy, but certainly it was a place that I had never experienced, and no one had ever told me about it, or I'd never read about it before. But it is meditation, I think, is important on so many levels. And again, depending on your personal practices and traditions, I think it's important to have a skilled guide, if you will. And I think from a Christian perspective, it's important also then to have a notion that the greater power, God, Jesus Christ, however you would describe the Lord, for me is it connects to your relationship on a very deep level. It's not about religion. It's about a relationship with my God, my Lord, and my Savior. And there's nothing that compares to the depth of that experience. It is truly divine. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, everyone. Yeah, so that was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I think we have reached very deep levels, and thanks to Scott also for helping us reach those deep levels all together. And we hope to see you later. Thanks so much to our speakers.
Thank you all.